Good afternoon, everyone. I've much enjoyed listening to your respective contributions today, and I'm glad to share my 2 cents as well. As introduction, my research and teaching here at UBC are broadly situated in the fields of ecological economics and industrial ecology. Most of my work revolves around methods for and applications of systems analytical modeling in the agri-food sector. To be frank, I'm not a trained moral philosopher, nor am I a legal theorist. So that said, you're probably wondering what on earth I'm doing talking to you about distributive justice and ecological law and governance. Well, as explanation, I went looking for the normative foundations in the ecological economics disciplinary literature to help contextualize my work. I assumed that such foundations would be well developed and readily available, but instead, finding a rather, I think, strange absence of a unifying normative foundation, I inadvertently fell down a rabbit hole. So today I'd like to share with you a little bit about that rabbit hole and where it led, and why I think that the questions and the possibilities it raises with respect to adopting an understanding of distributive justice and ecological economics that can bring internal consistency to the discipline and its policy prescriptions are also relevant questions and possibilities for ecological law and governance more generally. So I'm going to begin today by very briefly reflecting on the nature and purpose of economics as a general field of inquiry, and also why the theories and assumptions of economic disciplines, whatever their specifics, play such a pivotal role in our lives when they're actually implemented. I'll then outline in broad strokes some of the dominant contours, I think, of moral philosophy and competing understandings of distributive justice, and highlight that most ethical theory really is focused on the discrete autonomous individual. I'll next describe the overarching concerns of the discipline of ecological economics, and in particular, I'll highlight what many in the field see to be necessary conditions for achieving sustainability, and also point towards what is a current lack of coherence within the discipline in terms of a shared understanding of distributive justice that can serve to unite these conditions in an internally consistent manner. I'll also advance the argument that ecological communitarianism might actually provide a suitable basis for an understanding of distributive justice that can bring that internal consistency to how we understand sustainability and to the pursuit of sustainability as a normative goal. And then I'm going to conclude by inviting your reflection on what distributive justice means for you as scholars and practitioners of ecological law and governance, and in particular, whether a shared understanding of distributive justice is indeed desirable or even necessary to bring internal consistency to the normative prescriptions that flow from your work. So let's begin by considering the nature and the purpose of economics. According to an oft-cited definition, economics is concerned with the allocation of scarce resources among competing ends, as well as the distribution of costs and benefits between economic actors. So in other words, who gets what, and what makes a particular allocation of scarce resources and associated patterns of distribution legitimate as opposed to arbitrary. So implementing a systematic basis for allocation actually requires in advance that we resolve distributive norms, norms that both define the constellation of economic actors, as well as how and to whom the costs and benefits of economic activities accrue. So given that the meaning and the application of just distribution must in turn be founded on some shared interpretation of what's right or what's good, an economic system and the laws that govern it actually operationalize a core component of a society's moral universe. Hence, Lansana-Kaita's argument in defiance of economic positivism that all economics really should be considered branches of applied ethics. But what do we believe is right or good, and for whom? And how does this manifest in competing visions for economic organization? What do we understand to be a just distribution? I think that these should be fundamental questions for economists of any stripe, because their answers will ultimately serve to legitimize whatever economic policy prescriptions are preferred. Now, certainly there are competing approaches to defining what might be considered right or good. But if we look at the realm of moral philosophy, whether consequentialism, which underpins contemporary neoclassical economics, deontology, or even the bulk of environmental ethics, the majority of current ethical theory really has restricted this question to interhuman behavioral norms. It's really only in the realm of ecocentric ethics that we've seriously grappled with the moral relevance of ecological communities. And there are similarly competing conceptions of what distributive justice means. For libertarians, for example, distributive justice is that which provides individuals with the greatest freedom to pursue their self-interests. So the idea of free market democracy, the normative basis for neoclassical economics, derives from a consequentialist libertarian perspective. For socialists, on the other hand, equality rather than liberty is a moral imperative. So questions of distributive justice revolve around egalitarian access to resources. Liberalism attempts to balance the ideals of liberty and equality. I think probably best known is the rights-based variant of liberal justice as fairness that was advanced by John Rawls, who argues that distributive principles for society must be acceptable to free and rational persons under initial conditions of equality. But again, it's very important to note here that all of these conceptions of distributive justice focus on the autonomous individual as their locus of concern. So in the discipline of ecological economics, which is primarily concerned with understanding and providing an improved basis for managing the environmental dimensions of economic activity so as to advance the overarching objective of sustainability in terms of economic sustainability, as well as the sustainability of supporting social and ecological systems. Sustainability has been defined in a very particular way. It's actually in a seminal 1991 paper written by Herman Daly, who was one of the pioneering figures in this discipline, where there were three conditions necessary to sustainability that were articulated and have really come to enjoy considerable currency in the field. The first criterion is that the scale of economic activities must be constrained so as that we not overshoot the capacity of the ecosystems that enable them. The second criterion, recognizing that there are effectively limits on the resources available to support us within our finite biosphere, is that how we distribute rights and access to those finite life-sustaining resources, both within and across generations, must necessarily conform to some shared understanding of distributive justice. And the third criterion, which effectively operationalizes how we meet our distributive objectives within the constraints posed by the necessity of sustainable scale, is that we allocate these finite life-sustaining resources efficiently. Now, most work in ecological economics, I think it's fair to say, is empirical work concerned with the scale and the efficiency criteria. But it's important to remember that the relevance of sustainable scale and how we define efficiency and the normative weight of the goal of sustainability depends in large part on our understanding of distributive justice. My sense is that as a discipline, we've not yet arrived at a shared understanding of distributive justice that really unites these three variables in an internally consistent manner and that provides a compelling moral argument for prioritizing environmental sustainability. Now, this isn't to say that distributive justice has been ignored in the literature. When we look to work that's been published that has distributive themes, some of this has taken the perspective that the economic actor is a member of human communities and makes his or her decisions accordingly. And this is in clear distinction from the purely self-referential homo economicus of the neoclassical economic model. Now, interestingly, the dominant conception of distributive justice that seems to be invoked, whether in referring to property rights and redistribution or to environmental justice or the practice of discounting or otherwise, has been that of justice as fairness between individuals, so a liberal Rawlsian understanding of justice. And also interesting is that most of these discussions have been framed in purely anthropocentric terms. But the question that arises for me is this adequate? Does it reflect and resonate with what we know about the ecological economic actor and about the world? And I think that in some important respects, which really are pivotal to the discipline and how it understands sustainability, it does not. This is most apparent when we return to the question, who is the ecological economic actor to whom distributive justice might be owed? And I think that ecology, which ostensibly has lent its name to this brand of economics for good reason, can shed light on this seemingly very important question. A central insight of ecology is the idea that the discrete autonomous individuals is really somewhat of an abstraction. We simply cannot be understood as isolated autonomous entities. Rather, we're first and foremost members of both the human and the non-human natural communities, which together create the possibility of our emergence, our perpetuation, and our well-being. So I think it follows then that any economics, or more broadly, system of laws and governance, which takes serious account of this basic nature of the ecological economic actor, as a socio-ecological community member, must have at its base a commensurate understanding of the good and a corresponding conception of distributive justice. And of course, this begs the question, well, where might we locate suitable mooring points for this vision within the realm of moral philosophy? Well, this first requires a basis for adjudicating what is right or what is good for the ecological economic actor. And unfortunately, I feel that ethical theory, which takes as its unit of analysis or locus of concern the discrete autonomous individual, and that fails to account for the moral relevance of community, probably has little to offer in this regard. So this is true of much of humanistic ethics, including both consequential and rights-based theories, and it's similarly true of much of what's been advanced in terms of rights and welfare-based environmental ethics. And again, I suspect it's really only in the realm of ecocentric ethics, which take as their departure point the moral relevance of ecological communities, that we might find that potential mooring point for an ecologically informed conception of the right or of the good. An obvious example here would be Aldo Leopold's land ethic and its subsequent further development by J. Baird Callicott. Now, according to Leopold, ethics actually originate in the tendency of interdependent groups to codify behavioral norms which promote mutual flourishing. So in this light, ethics are evolutionary adaptive phenomenon and are an emergent property of successful communities. And so based on the insights of modern ecology, Leopold argued for a commensurate expansion of our ethical community. Arne Naess's Deep Ecology similarly begins with a criticism of the narrow identification of the self, which animates most ethical theory, what Ellen Watts first described as the skin-encapsulated ego. And what both of these moral philosophies imply is that if we take seriously the reality of ecological interdependence, then right action as a starting point is that which maintains the integrity of the ecological community as a whole. So with this in mind, we similarly need to identify an understanding of distributive justice for the ecological economic actor, which is consistent with the moral imperative of preserving the ecological community. And I think one quite interesting alternative to individualist approaches is the conception of distributive justice that flows from communitarianism, which itself arose in critical response to the liberal de-emphasis of community. Communitarians advance three core critiques of liberalism. First, it's argued that principles of justice are very often context-specific and can only be understood relative to the conditions of the culture in question. And I think this resonates with Leopold's perspective on the evolutionary adaptive nature of ethics. In contrast to the liberal focus on the self, communitarians also argue that humans are social animals defined in relation to a polis rather than self-sufficient entities. Hence, the politics of distribution need to respect the requirement to sustain and to promote the communities that are essential to who we are, rather than simply ensure the conditions necessary to autonomous choice. And while communitarians have yet to really seriously take into consideration the implications of ecology, this would seemingly require a very modest leap. And it may be that an ecological communitarianism and the related conception of distributive justice actually provides the most unifying and internally consistent ethical mooring point for ecological economics. The reality of ecological interdependence suggests to me that environmental sustainability is in fact the first principle of distributive justice for the ecological economic actor. And if we understand sustainability as requiring the satisfaction of those three core criteria, appropriate scale, just distribution, and efficient allocation, then we require an understanding of distributive justice, which unites these three variables in a consistent manner. I think that ecological communitarianism satisfies this requirement, both because its locus of concern is maintaining the integrity of those mutually constituting human and non-human natural communities that are essential to our well-being, but also because it serves to legitimize the scale and the efficiency criteria. Sustainable scale dictates the necessary first order condition for sustainability, and in consequence of distributive justice for the ecological economic actor. Within this context, we seek efficient allocation, and this has to, at least in part, account for the material and energetic basis of economic activities, such that we can meet the needs of both human and non-human natural communities, within and across generations, and within the scales, the constraints that are imposed by the need for a sustainable scale. So distributive justice for the ecological economic actor is achieved when our systems of economic organization and governance enable this. So through the lens of ecological communitarianism, we can arrive at an internally consistent basis for advocating the scale, efficiency, and just distribution variables as the foundation of sustainability, which itself becomes the overarching normative objective. So ecological law and governance is similarly premised on the recognition of ecological interdependence and is oriented towards maintaining ecological integrity on this basis. So in conclusion, I would like to invite your thoughts and your reflections with respect to two questions. The first is, can and should ecological communitarianism or some derivative be foundational to ecological law and governance scholarship in terms of providing that basis first for concretely identifying its subjects and also for providing legitimacy to its prescriptions? And if so, how necessary and useful is it in the field of ecological law and governance to be explicit about such a foundation and to have a shared unifying foundation? So thank you. I look forward to your reflections.
Discussion from people in the room? Well, I'll start with a question. My question regards the rights of ecological entities along the lines that Pat was talking about. I'm wondering what people think of the idea of liabilities going along with rights of nature. Do you think that's necessary? And do you think that there has to be a symmetrical approach to that? Or do you think that you can have rights of nature unaccompanied by liabilities?
I think that question really speaks to a division in the environmental ethics literature between various authors that have contributed to the discussion around holism. You know, on the one hand, we can think about Brian Norton's contributions with respect to what he calls a weak anthropocentric holism. And on the other hand, what J. Baird Callicott and Laura Westra have advanced, where they argue for attributing non-instrumental intrinsic value to nature, I guess what you call ecocentrism. And there's been a lot of back and forth in the literature as to whether or not, you know, nature should be attributed rights and whether or not that's useful. And from my perspective, I don't know that we need to be mired in that debate as a starting point. If we recognize ecological interdependence, it really, I think, dissolves the importance of that distinction.
In terms of the legal frameworks that are available around the world, however, in the New Zealand case and the Indian case, and certainly if this were ever to become realized in the US, you would be dealing with some pre-existing frameworks. And so the language of rights and liabilities would be very much a part of that. And what I'm wondering is whether it would make sense to have asymmetric rights of ecological entities without unaccompanied liabilities. So I don't know what it would mean, for example, to hold a river responsible for flooding, or to hold insects responsible for infesting a field. And to me, that concept is really troublesome. And we have asymmetric rights already when we talk about, for example, infants or people with severe disabilities. They are not usually held responsible for their action and they don't have liabilities. So I'm just wondering whether you think the same treatment of ecological entities would make sense if you are plugging into pre-existing legal frameworks.
I see what you're saying. That's very interesting, and I have to admit, a lot of what I've heard today has been quite new to me, including many of the examples from case law of extending rights to ecological entities. And I can see the attractiveness and the power of doing so in order to function within existing legal frameworks. I'm also very attracted to the idea of fundamental ecological rights. I mean, we now internationally, we have a variety of internationally accepted basic rights. You know, the conventions of the International Labor Organization would be one good example. You know, Charter of Fundamental Human Rights and Freedoms, another. If we accept ecological interdependence, then it seems that the next necessary frontier for universal rights is with respect to access to ecological integrity. And if that was enshrined in a legal sense, then perhaps that would even obviate the need of a case-by-case basis for extending rights to specific ecological entities, because then it becomes, ecological integrity becomes the primary concern for the human actor.
So I was just going to say that for me, what is interesting about the rights of nature is kind of the shock that it provides for thinking outside the usual paradigm, and that it is important to, to understand that we have relationships with non-humans and that we affect them and they affect us and our lives are bound up together. But in terms of the legal processes, it seems to me that the actors that matter, the people, the actors whose behavior we're trying to change are the people who should have responsibilities. So that maybe we should be looking through paradigms such as, in terms of fiduciary models or accountability models instead of, I think the rights is just a means to an end rather than kind of, necessarily the like a whole framework in itself.
Jeff?
I think I was thinking something similar. I mean, I've thought of the set of problems we've been talking about here is really about humans managing themselves, and all of these concepts they're social constructs. They're constructs that come out of human minds necessarily, and the way they'll be administered, implemented, enforced, even created is inevitably through human agency. And so I also had, if we're gonna, I think it's a very, very useful question to be asked. I don't know if I have a full answer, but what Kirsten just said about the extent at which that question puts the focus back on human responsibilities, which is always another part of this discussion, another unsolved part of the puzzle. We talk about human rights, but much, much less about human responsibilities in this arena. So I'm glad that the question is getting asked. I think it's something that we have to continue to struggle together with.
Yes.
Oh, hello. I have two questions, one for each. Jet lag. Two questions, one for different people. Can I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
PhD, can't you tell? Thank you. Kirsten, I'll ask my question to you first. You had talked, and I agree wholeheartedly, you were talking about how if particularly colonial societies are trying to grapple with who speaks for nature or who protects and who cares, you know, how we work together with First Nations people. As an Australian, this is something we grapple with a lot, whatever we do, and we work side by side with a lot of friends and colleagues. But I was just wondering, from your experience and your research, what do you think are some of the most effective ways that people have found for First Nations and settler people to work together, like actually work together, just to care for country, which is an Aussie term.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and my second question was to Pat.
Mm-hmm.
Pat? Yes. And it's not a question so much as when you were giving an overview of the Ecuadorian constitution, you might be very interested in one of the only cool, successful cases around rights of nature based on the Ecuadorian constitution, the Barber River case. There's an English version of summary notes. If you can't find it, shoot me a note. We've got it. Actually, we've got it on the ELGA website, but it should be on the Global Alliance website. And it answers some of your questions. Standing was for anyone. And they did look for costs. They looked for cover.
Could you just repeat the name of that case again?
The case?
Yeah, that you just mentioned.
That's right, and I might be saying it wrong because my Aussie accent pronounces lots of things in a fun way. It's the Biography River, V-I-L-C-A-M. No, C-A. Man, that's right. Biography. I'll look it up for you later.
It was in the slide.
Did he? Because he's asking questions that are answered by the Biography River case. It covered standing, it covered obligations, restoration. It's kind of pretty clear. And I often teach it to my students. It's a really neat case.
That was the case where the dam was built anyway.
No, that's different. No,
Okay.
it wasn't them. It wasn't that case.
Excuse me.
I made a type, but I'm not that way.
Okay.
That was more of a statement, so maybe back to Kristen.
Thank you.
I don't
No
have
worries.
I don't have jet lag, but I also haven't slept much in the last week. So I'm trying to, you know, I'm thinking, because I have a tendency to think of bad examples. That's what I concentrate on rather than the success stories. I'm thinking about collaborations where the invitation has been extended by Indigenous peoples to undertake things on their terms. And for example, I was actually thinking about this example this morning when, I'm not going to be able to remember the exact context, but it was sort of in the framing, perhaps it was in the context, yes, it was Peter Burton's talk about how things are framed in terms of terrorism and you know, threats and so on. But even framing things as protest, you know, characterizes the protesters as sort of the renegades, the outlaws, et cetera, et cetera. And there was an interesting comment by Naomi Klein the other day that one of the contributions of Indigenous peoples to this land protection movement is framing it not as protest but as ceremony, and as, you know, land defenders and protectors and so on. And so inviting allies on board on those grounds, you know, I think has been successful. I can't give you a concrete example.
No, that's okay. That's good. Thank you.
Kendon?
I'm puzzled by the idea of standing in the rights of nature setting. Pat, I think you spoke of a process by which something like a guardian ad litem would be appointed for the river, just to simplify it. And you said the Ecuadorian case said anybody. But those are human actors. Does that suggest that somehow the rights of natural entities really are only those that are somehow articulated and pursued by human actors for human ends, whatever they may be?
That's certainly the case in the United States. We have lots of cases that are denominated Palila versus Department of Interior, or Loggerhead Turtle versus County of Volusia. So we don't have any trouble pretending that we're giving standing to natural organisms, but they're always voiced by humans, the anthropomorphic spin that gives it. So there's no way, I mean, in the cetacean case, the Ninth Circuit panel asked the lawyer who was arguing, so what advice did your clients give you today? And he said, well, I'm channeling them as I speak. So there you go. It does come down to a guardian ad litem next friend concept. I don't know how else it could possibly be.
Can I just add one small thing? Again, when we talk about these issues and the work we do and the way we teach it to students is if a completely fictional entity, something as imaginary as a unicorn, like a corporation, can have its rights and interests represented by a human being, why can't the basic animal or plant species? We're assuming what we think is best for the corporation is its interest in the shareholders or whatever. You look at a frog or you look at a fish, I mean, Thomas Berry talks about this.
But the corporation, the structure of corporation law sets some limits on who those human actors may be. This seems rather open-ended in either Pat's account or the Ecuadorian.
Right, but there's a certain cynicism behind that, you know, that, not, maybe not by you, but by other people that, you know, that it's necessarily just the human act of making stuff up, essentially. But, you know, there's a book by Will Kimlicker and his partner called Zoopolis, and it goes sort of into this, it's a theory of citizenship for animals, essentially. And, you know, animals can communicate their needs and interests to us.
You can quantify that. I mean, the frog doesn't want a Porsche. You know, the frog doesn't want to fly in an aeroplane. The frog just wants its ecosystem and a place to live. And that can be quantified. Modern science knows most of the stuff. Indigenous cultures know it too. I don't have a problem with that aspect of it. I think if you play with it enough, you can actually make it work. In terms of where rights bump into rights, sure, that's tricky. But again, Mari Margle and the Selden Gang, lots and lots of people write about this stuff. If you explore the literature, there's a lot more doable stuff in there than your average lawyer critiquing it is going to work out. So.
And not just through scientific methodologies. As a follow-up to the rights of nature in Ecuador, there's a statement put out by the Zapara Nation, who were heavily involved with bringing the rights of nature into the Constitution, and they're trying to explain what the rights of nature mean for them. And they go into, and I think Cormac Cullinan talks about this in his book, the forest is actually kind of personified for them by a spirit master who they access through their dream states and through taking ayahuasca, and this entity literally speaks to them and tells them things in it. So, you know, you can just dismiss that as an hallucination or whatever, but there's a kind of, you know, there is a way of scientifically showing that there is some basis to that sort of sense of communicating with this entity that is the forest. And they explicitly state, you know, the person that needs to be consulted in the rights of nature is not like us directly, but the spirit master in the forest. And we are conduits for that because we have this deep relationship with it, and it speaks to us and we speak to it in our dreams. And this is very hard to entertain within the rationalist paradigm, because of course you have to, well, that's just politics, you know, that's just, they're just saying that, it's not real, right? Is it?
Well, I didn't put it in the agenda, but we'll actually be taking that before we have our interaction.
Could I just jump in? I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
Yes.
So I wanted to say that I think one of the appeals of the concept of the Anthropocene for me is that it's very closely related to the idea of planetary boundaries. And boundaries is much easier to work with, I think, in terms of ecological law objectives, because it's about limits and restrictions and conditions. Whereas, and so that's, you know, limits, restrictions, conditions maintains a strongly physical materialist focus, which maintains an integrity of life and non-life on Earth. Rights for nature maintains the separateness, which, you know, because rights is very atomistic logic. Its premise is individualism. And I think that it's part of the cause of the problem. And for me, rights for nature, I mean, I listen
Oh, you're frozen down.
some serious obstacles, but at the same time, and I appreciate Rights for Nature's goals, but the Anthropocene is not about individuals and it's not about entitlement. And rights is about entitlement. And I think the earlier comment about responsibilities and focusing attention on human self-restriction, human self-regulation is what the Anthropocene offers. And I think we need to embrace this and jump away, move away from atomized, individualistic, entitled discourses and towards integrated and relational and very physically oriented legal frameworks.